How do we deal with the growing volume and cost of hazardous medical waste in hospitals? To answer this pressing question, I brought in Andy Marshall. Andy is the CEO of Sterilis Solutions, a medical waste treatment company specializing in on-site sterilization equipment of hazardous medical waste in hospitals. In this episode, you're going to learn how much medical waste is actually costing hospitals, why landfill is still widely used, especially in the US, how on-site treatment changes cost, liability, and sustainability outcomes, and what medical device companies can do to address these challenges. I'm Lucas Penegonda, and I help MedTech companies to be more sustainable with plastics, and here's our discussion. Hi, Andy, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lucas. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Andy, you're the CEO of a company that manufactures medical waste. I'd say medical waste treatment equipment. Is that a good way of putting it?
That's actually a great way to put it, Lucas. Yeah. So for the last 6.5 years, I've been fortunate enough to serve as the CEO for Sterilis Solutions.
Good. So what is the current problem with infectious medical waste, and what's your approach to solving this?
Yeah, there's actually a number of problems with the way regulated medical waste has been handled for the last, 40 or 50 years. The way that medical waste is handled today is a combination of both on-site staff through the hospital or laboratory or through the waste generator, if you will, in general, as well as a third party. So it's kind of in two parts. The waste generator, so again, the hospital, the clinic, the laboratory, et cetera, is responsible for kind of shuttling their own waste from one place in a facility to the next, where it goes into effectively a holding room until at some point in the future it is picked up by a third-party waste hauling company. Okay, so it leads to a number of issues. Starting off, let's talk about safety, right? It's not far-fetched to believe that the longer regulated medical waste hangs around a specific location, the greater potential risk it puts those who could or may come into contact with it. So let me give you an example of that, just to kind of put a little more color around it. Every single day, just in the United States, there are over 1,000 needle stick injuries per day. That was a shocking number the first time I had heard it. And it's not decreased. And it's something as simple as removing a sharps container from a wall that is overfilled with the pointy end of a syringe sticking out of it. From there, it snowballs into that the impacted person having blood tests and treatment and all of those kinds of things. Along those same lines, but separate from that, is the liability that comes along with it. And that liability is really multifold, right? It's liability from the employer of the affected or the injured person. It comes in the form of liability from the medical waste generator, driving someone else's waste down the road and all of the things that could happen there. Other issues, it's expensive. Okay, and it is not uncommon that our customers have realized a 10 to 20% year over year waste hauling cost increase every single year, and it just continues, it seems like infinitum. But one of the bigger reasons, Lucas, that I would say been more successful over the last 5 years is due to the fact that sustainability is front of mind, top of mind for so many medical waste generators. And they are looking to take action against the current process and replace it with something that is a greater benefit to all of us, frankly.
Okay. So let me summarize quickly, because that was a lot to take in. The first pain point is the logistics. How do we handle the waste? How do we store the waste? And the safety concerns associated with it. As you mentioned, needle stick injuries. That's actually a pretty high number, 1,000 a day. That's a lot. Then you have the liability. So liability associated with all this safety risk. Then cost is going to be very costly to dispose of all of this waste. And on top of that is sustainability. So are we really sustainable if we're generating so much waste? And this is something that I've seen a lot. If you talk to clinics, to hospitals, to practitioners, surgeons, healthcare professionals, they equate the thing sustainability with medical waste. So why is this waste such a pain point? Not only from a cost perspective, and you might also elaborate on what the costs of medical waste is, but why is the sustainability piece so focused on, let's say, the waste? Because you could also be looking at whatever energy that is being used or gases that are being used in the hospital. So why is waste, let's say, sustainability focus of the hospitals?
Yeah, so I would say that, to kind of start with the last question first, why is waste impacting a hospital sustainability? Actually, waste has kind of come at the tail end of it. Our customers, many of which have installed renewable energy sources, for example, solar and things along those lines. And those were easier, frankly, to tackle. Now everybody's looking to address the elephant in the room, which historically has been regulated medical waste. Because until more recently, they really didn't know that they had other opportunities or other options to be able to find a more sustainable approach and pathways for that waste in a post, single-use plastics, right, is what we hear so much of. If we're talking about laboratories, they're going through just mountains of pipette tips made out of polypropylene. If we're talking about hospitals, they're going through mountains of everything, right? Everything from gloves and gauze and bandages and sharps and so forth and so on. Why is it something that's on their radar today? Is because now they're much more aware of how that waste has been dealt with through incineration, through offsite treatment, going to landfill, and they know that they need to do better, but they really haven't been exposed to how to do better until, let's say, the last 5 to 7 years.
Maybe you can elaborate on how hazardous medical waste or regulated medical waste, as you call it, is handled today. So you mentioned incineration, a landfill, off-site treatment. So what is most prevalent here? Why is it so expensive to dispose of?
We see regulated medical waste through third-party hauling companies handled in a couple of different primary methods. One is an off-site treatment facility. It could be something, for example, like a large format autoclave, in which they make that waste sterile, and from that point it goes directly to a landfill, right? So it's occupying, it really retains its original shape and size and form factor, and then it just gets carted off to a landfill. Another, but certainly less popular option is incineration. Okay. Incineration is basically exactly as it sounds. They take the waste, burn it, releasing a tremendous amount of pollutants into the environment, and then they ultimately take the remnants, the ash, if you will, and deposit that in a landfill also. The third option, and we see it a little bit in the US, but it is certainly more predominant in some European countries, is what's known as waste to energy. Waste to energy on its surface sounds like a pretty good proposition until you actually really begin to understand that, from my perspective at least, it's essentially incineration repackaged with a nicer term, because the amount of energy through waste to energy that's actually returned to the grid, as an example, is so de minimis and still such a dirty process that most people are actually surprised when they learn that it is marginally better than straight incineration.
I mean, I can also only speak for Switzerland because I'm not very, very aware of like the waste management all over the world. You can speak more about the US. So what we have is we have a ban on landfill. So we can't landfill. What we'll have to do is we'll have to do controlled incineration. And basically every incineration plant is also a power plant. So that is waste energy recovery. And you spoke to the pollutants. Like if you do it not properly, that's certainly an issue. However, you need to have a lot of filters, and it's quite expensive to have those filters, because there, as you say, if you do not properly, you will get a lot of pollutants out on the environment. But it can be done properly. However, is it the best thing you can do with something like a medical device that also has sometimes precious metals, sometimes very high value materials? It's probably not. It's like I always say, it's like energy recovery is not the worst thing you can do, but it's also not the best. It's like the worst thing you can do is like litter it into the environment and see what happens. But as you told me that, it's like I was pretty surprised, because like in my mind, medical waste was always going to either incineration or energy recovery. But when you told me it's like they're going to put it on landfill, so are they at least going to sterilize it before they put it to landfill? That is what he said.
Yeah, so that is supposed to be what happens. However, sometimes it does not. So in the US, as an example, and kind of going back to that liability topic, in the US and in many, I would say actually most European countries, liability rests on the shoulders of the waste generator from cradle to grave. So from the point that it actually becomes categorized or classified as regulated medical waste until they receive a certificate of destruction back from that third-party hauling company, it's still the waste generator's problem. So if I'm a doctor and you're my waste hauler and you come pick up a sharps container from my office and you drive down the road and your vehicle gets hit by a train and that sharps container gets bust open and syringes go flying all over the roadway, and someone gets stuck by that syringe in the process of cleanup, that's my problem as the waste generator. You have no liability as very little, if any, liability as the waste hauler, which seems crazy to think that it's structured that way, but it is what it is. And it's often an overlooked concern until it happens to you. And there are numerous examples that we pull up that happens in the US where even if it's not a liability issue from a transportation side of things, if that waste hauling company doesn't do its job and untreated medical waste is found in a landfill, it's traced back to the waste generator. And guess whose name is all over the front page of the newspaper? It's XYZ Hospital or ABC Lab, and that's who's taken the brunt of the damage from it.
Yeah. And then the question is like, if the waste hauling companies do not take the liability on their shoulders, is why the hell is it so expensive?
Yeah. So back to that topic of expense. These offsite treatment facilities, let's say it's a large format autoclave or it's a incinerator and so forth. Why is it so expensive? Really, it's a logistics business at the end of the day, where there are people driving big trucks from stop to stop to stop. If we look back at what's happened really across the globe in the past 5 years, 6 years or so, is the cost of labor has skyrocketed. The cost of fuel has exploded. Everything from an inflationary perspective has grown in expense, right? So you've got equipment, you've got labor, and so forth. That's really created a perfect storm that's kind of created a runaway train in terms of the expense. The incinerators, waste to energy types of approaches are layered with regulations, approvals, permitting, re-inspections, and so forth. It's also very costly. And most of these waste hauling companies, several of these waste hauling companies in the US are publicly owned, publicly traded, and need to continue to show a profit.
Do you think that is basically what drives the cost? Is that it's logistics, energy, and inflation?
That's a vast majority of the contributor to the continuous escalating cost.
Yeah. So because what I've seen in Europe, and I mean, maybe you can speak to that. I know that you're a little more focused on the US, is that a lot of these special permits. So in Europe, you need special permits to transport this special waste. And these permits are not as easy to get. So there's usually a very select few, let's say, who can actually do it. So they basically have a monopoly on that stuff, which means that they are going to use that monopoly in order to secure their prices. So what I've seen in hospitals around Switzerland is that you would pay around 800 to 1,000 euros per ton of what you call regulated medical waste. And that is one of the key, let's say, drivers in cost for hospitals. If you have like 90 tons of this a year, that's going to add up. And you're a small hospital. So maybe you can elaborate what the cost is, like a range in the US, from what you have seen. Then we're going to get into what do you guys actually do?
The range in cost is so great that it's almost like opening up a present on Christmas morning, because you never know what it is until you pull the packaging off. So when we're engaging and consulting with folks, frankly, all over the world, whether it's in Europe or the US or Australia, parts of Asia and so forth, it's so interesting to see that you can have two hospitals situated across the street from one another, same size, generating the same amount of regulated medical waste, hypothetically. And one is paying twice as much as the other, or 3 times as much, or 4 times as much. The pricing, the way it is structured in the US and many parts of Europe, is the waste hauling company will charge their customers whatever they can get away with. So if I think I can charge you $4 a pound, then you're going to get charged $4 a pound. But if somebody else is really beating me up on pricing or is a heck of a negotiator and the price they're paying is 50 cents a pound, then I get 50 cents a pound, right? As an example. So we see pricing anywhere, if we kind of distill it down to on a per pound basis or a per kilo basis even, we can see it down to 40 cents a pound, and we've seen it all the way up to $17 a pound. Okay. And that's even within the same zip code or same geographic area. Now, one of the things that's also an interesting thing to point out as well is once you kind of look past either coast, West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, where everything's very expensive, or New York, New Jersey, all the way down to Florida, also things are very expensive. Once you get into kind of the middle of the country, it's a lot more rural in terms of the environment. So what that means is the waste hauling companies have further to drive between point A and point B, which adds to their cost, which really adds a great deal more cost to some of the more rurally located waste generators. They're often also serviced less often. So they're having to store more waste because nobody's coming by once a day or once a week. They might be by once a month. And that's if there aren't any service level issues or other dynamics that come into play. So the pricing is insane. And, it's really unique to each customer. I'll tell you, in the UK and in France and other parts of the EU, we see pricing that is double, sometimes triple what we see in the US, which is already very expensive. If we look at other parts of North America, like in Canada, it's easily 2 to 4 times as expensive here as it is here in the US, which is, again, already expensive. If we look into Mexico and other markets, Central America, South America, it's oftentimes a lot less expensive. Fewer regulations. If you want to set up a burn pit and burn waste in the middle of the desert in Mexico, it's probably happening. Okay, so it's very, very inexpensive there.
Okay, so what you've laid out is now that the waste problem is actually a very, very severe one. and it's driving costs. It's not good for sustainability. Liability is high. There are logistic problems involved. It's a safety issue. So how the hell do we deal with this? So maybe you might elaborate on, let's say, on-site treatment of waste. So maybe elaborate your system that you developed, and maybe also, if you have insights to those, like maybe also like other potential solutions that could go into this, because we are an industry, we have an old supply chain. So maybe you can also elaborate, what could a medical device manufacturer do to their devices in order to make this problem a little more bearable, let's say.
Let's start at the end first. So what can medical device companies do and be cognizant of in the design of their products and future releases and so forth? I think really, Lucas, it's an awareness of the content that they're manufacturing these devices from. It's an awareness of the type of plastics. Are those truly single-use plastics? Are they kind of the lower end of the spectrum in terms of plastics? Or are they kind of what I refer to as the higher end plastic, right? So polypropylene, polyethylene, polystyrene, LDPE, HDPE, and so forth, low density polyethylene, high density polyethylene, and so on, where what we've seen is some really interesting pathways for a circular approach for those plastics, where they're effectively taking it and converting it back into its original, monomers and polymers to reintroduce into the supply chain. If manufacturers can get on board with understanding what the capabilities are in the market to be able to create true, like no kidding, landfill avoidance and a circular pathway for those plastics, that's panacea, right? That's the promised land where we need to go. Now you ask, on-site versus off-site. Our company happens to specialize in enabling our customers to break the cycle, break this vicious cycle that they've been stuck in for decades of dealing with third-party medical waste hauling companies and all of the challenges that come with that. For example, our company manufactures a product that resides on site. So the hospital, the lab, the doctor's office, etc., where they're able to take their regulated medical waste, treat it on site, and make it recycle ready so that it can avoid landfill, it can avoid incineration, it can avoid waste to energy demise, if you will. And it's a simple yet complex technology at the same time. Simple from the standpoint that we're using tried and true sterilization techniques to make the waste safe first. That's followed by a shredding process that reduces the overall waste volume so that when the recycler is able to come pick up that shredded confetti, which are effectively the remnants left of the customer's waste, they're able to haul on average 5 times as much per load as they would have otherwise, which is significant when you're looking at a CO2 perspective. In the same breath, I'll share with you that we don't just believe our product, our offering is a greener alternative to medical waste hauling companies. We can prove it. And we've done so through a life cycle assessment, which has been peer reviewed now 3 times over, that shows kind of the from and the to. Here's what their carbon footprint looks like, specifically related to their regulated medical waste streams and third-party hauling companies through whatever disposal method they're using at the time, compared to our product and recycling or even landfill. But there's a number of different opportunities for customers to do that. Now, we're not talking about a little bit of carbon footprint reduction. We're looking at, really on the lower end, 94, 95% reduction on up well past carbon neutral, depending on what the customers elect to do with their waste once it's been made safe.
Okay. I mean, you made a bunch of very good points, like starting with your like advice to medical device companies. And I think this goes into the direction of eco-design. So design for recycling, either first of all, reducing the overall material used, then choosing the right plastics in order to make them recyclable, avoiding things that make recycling in the end a little more difficult. And then I think you made a brilliant point about volume reduction, is because if you've ever tried recycling plastics at your home, which I tried out, it's like if you have a 60-liter bag, it's like you can put it on your scale and it's around like 6, 8, 9 kilos. So like for the US colleagues, that's like 10 pounds for 60 liters. So that is definitely very, very, I'd say, low density in this case. And this is one challenge. And I think this is also one factor contributing to medical waste being so expensive, because it's just like a lot of air. And if you're transporting a lot of air, that's not very efficient. But there's no real way besides just like cramping it together and just pressurizing it and stamping it into balls. There's no other way than just to reduce the volume. So if you shred it, the volume will be greatly reduced, and that adds a lot of efficiency. Secondly, what you're doing is you're sterilizing it. So what we have, you might elaborate on if there might be differences in the US, but what we have in Europe, at least in Switzerland, is like you have this waste code. It's like that there's a bunch of waste codes, and one is associated with infectious medical waste. And you have to burn infectious medical waste unless you change the waste code. And if you want to change the waste code, you have to go through the sterilization step, which you do. So if you sterilize it, you change it to something that is akin to household waste. So you can treat it as household waste. So you do two things. You reduce the volume and you change the waste code so that it can be dealt with as normal or household waste, which you can recycle, or you can be giving to, also if you want to, let's say a standard waste hauler instead of a medical waste hauler, which are a lot less expensive. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you're spot on. Yep, that's exactly right.
Perfect. Good. So how does your system look? How can we imagine that?
Yeah, so the product that we produce, we call the remediator. And the remediator is about the size of an office copier, like a Xerox copier, or maybe a washing machine or dryer, somewhere in that range. Again, it's a combination of several technologies, obviously the sterilization element, the shredding component, but also the technology end. Okay. And what most people, I would say, are probably very surprised to learn about our product is that it is a cloud connected product. Okay. And it's cloud connected for several different reasons. One, it allows us as the OEM, as the manufacturer and service provider, to maintain continuous connection with the product to monitor its performance. It allows us to be predictive as opposed to reactive for servicing the machine periodically for preventative maintenance and so forth. The next thing it does is a tremendous benefit for the customer. The benefit for the customer is that all of the information that they're capturing by hand today, dealing with their waste hauling company, the manifest, if you will, for traceability of that medical waste, is now effectively done for them, stored in the cloud, in which they're able to produce and run their own reports on demand 24/7, 365. So not only do we offer the hardware, but we offer the software to go along with it as its companion. And it saves them a tremendous amount of time. So somebody's not putting pen to paper. Somebody's not having to sign these forms in triplicate and file this away and give that one to this person and another form to that person, and save them for regulatory officials or somebody somewhere down the road. Now it's all at their fingertips, and they can access it 24/7, 365. It's got convenient reminders in there to be able to remind them and or even require them to run periodically like a biological challenge or a biovalidation, which is going to be something that is required from the regulatory end of things. So it's a little bit of technology and it's a little bit hardware, and ultimately what we've been able to produce between both of those has turned into an amazing product. And again, we're selling these in practically every corner of the world.
I mean, that sounds a little bit too good to be true. So maybe let's run through what the machine can and cannot do in terms of volume and devices. What can I put in it? What can't I put in it? So what are the limitations on the volume and the kinds of devices that I could be putting in there?
Yeah, sure. So volume wise on a per cycle basis. So you deposit waste, you push play. At what point is that cycle complete? It's generally about an hour's time. Volumetrically, it's 5 gallons or 19 liters per cycle. If that doesn't satisfy the customer's needs, they can always add another machine, a second, a third, a fourth. We have some customers with 6 or 7 or even 8 units at a single location. The do's and don'ts. What do you put in versus what don't you put in? Well, since we're using pressurized saturated steam to provide sterilization, much like you might find in an autoclave, pressurized saturated steam is perfect for sharps containers and the syringes held within them. It's also perfect for biohazardous waste. So blood-soaked gauze, bandages, gloves, those sorts of things, drapes from surgical areas and so forth. But really, what does not belong in the machine? Pharmaceutical waste, okay, whether it's expired medications and those kinds of things. And really, it's for a couple of different reasons. One is for traceability. From the regulator's perspective, they're going to want to see a very clear chain of custody all the way through destruction of things like expired or unused prescription medications, especially scheduled narcotics. Another area that our product does not treat is going to be chemo waste, right? Simply because of the reactivity of the chemo just by its nature alone. If you add that to high heat, high pressure situation or high heat, high pressure treatment, it's not going to end very well. And then lastly is going to be a pathological waste. And really what I'm referring more to relative to pathological waste are things along the lines of organs, amputated limbs, those types of things. At the end of the day, Lucas, we're addressing 90% or more of their overall regulated medical waste stream, which generally is 95% or more of the cost associated with getting rid of that medical waste.
Yeah, so what I've seen, and I understand if you don't like, if I talk a little bit about what other competitors of you do, so you're not the only company offering such a on-site waste treatment. What I've seen is like the competitor's machine that I've seen is a little bigger. It can take in like a whole container. And what they claim is like everything besides a titanium hip plant can be thrown in there. So like what are your limitations in terms of like what devices you can and cannot shredder? So how powerful is your shredder? So if I have a bunch of staplers and surgical devices and all that stuff, is that going to go through?
So our grinder shredder, if you will, is made of 440 stainless steel. We've not found a way to be able to process titanium implants, for example, hips and knees and screws and things along those lines. Titanium versus stainless steel and hoping for a successful outcome is not going to be great. So at the same time, that titanium should be set aside and recycled and not processed for incineration or landfill. So staplers, scissors, things along those lines, process just fine. Titanium hips and knees and implants, e-waste doesn't belong in there either, which should be self-evident, but oftentimes it isn't. Don't belong in there. We process a ton of surgical scopes, for example. Okay, endoscopes and bronchioscopes and different things along those lines. And there's some real advances in that market to where they're thinking more deeply around the types of materials that they're using to construct those scopes and what can be done in a post-use environment with the materials they're using now.
I've seen that too. It's like endoscopy is one of the areas that are really pushing for more sustainability. Also due to the fact that single-use endoscopy has been very, very popular in the last several years. So, I mean, you've elaborated on the environmental benefits, and whoever wants to check your LCA can be looking at that on your website, from what I've seen. And then you might also elaborate on the cost savings, because like I imagine, like if you put in cost as such a prevalent problem, this is probably also what you address.
Absolutely. So again, given that each customer and what they're currently paying their waste hauling company is really essentially unique to them, we go through and do a complete analysis. So I've got an analysis team here that goes through and understands exactly what the customer is generating from a waste perspective. And if that same customer will provide us with their costs, then we'll put together a full return on investment or monthly savings model to be able to show them. And effectively, we're just using their data to be able to produce that analysis on their behalf. What we're seeing in terms of cost savings, I show customers everything from 5 to 6 month return on investments to 8, 9, 10, 12 month return on investments, 20, 30, 40, 50 month return on investments. So they're not all created equal, right? There's kind of a Goldilocks zone between how much waste they're generating and how much they're spending relative to how our product fits in that equation financially. So what we are finding is 9 out of 10 customers are saving a considerable amount of money. But again, it's all relative to how much they're generating. There's some customers that will save, $1 million in 3 years or $2 million in 5 years. It really is a function of how much waste they're producing and how much they're being charged by their waste hauling company.
Okay, good. So perfect. Thank you for your insights. I mean, Andy, we're going to go to the personal part now. What motivates you personally to be on this journey on making medical waste better?
Whether it's a character flaw or a personal flaw, I kind of prefer the road less traveled, right? So throughout my career, I've never been interested in joining in companies that have a me too product. Well, you have that. Well, I have that too. And, mine is a prettier color than theirs. I prefer disruptive innovation every single time. And if you look at every step along the way for me personally, career-wise, it's always been taking the road less traveled and kind of trailblazing and disrupting something that certainly deserves it, not just for the sake of saying you disrupted, but for the sake of replacing it with something far better. And the opportunity with Sterilis Solutions has provided just that.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to add to it, I think. So, Andy, let's come to the last question. What advice would you like to give to MedTech companies out there, to hospitals in terms of regulated medical waste?
Yeah, so for MedTech companies specifically, I know that there's a much greater effort put toward, conscientious selection of materials that are being utilized to produce new product. What I would suggest is that they engage in and with design firms that can help them fill in their blind spots in saying, okay, we've got 3 different materials that we can use for the outer shell of whatever device that they're producing. It's not close your eyes and throw a dart at the dartboard and let's choose that one. It is engage with those who specialize in that specific arena to be able to help guide them. Medical device companies, they're large, they're small, and the larger ones sometimes are really well resourced, but we've all got our blind spots. So I think pulling in, design firms, consultants, and so forth to help make sure that they're making the best decisions through their design process, I think is critical at this point. especially and specifically with the advancements being made on the circularity front, because that one choice can determine a base hit from a home run relative to how their customers are now viewing the world, relative to, again, finding alternate pathways from a landfill for end of life for those products. For hospitals, for waste generators really of any kind, it's getting them to think differently and being able to conceive the reality of a different process that's available other than somebody showing up once a day or once a week or once a month and picking up a container of waste and driving it and thinking that it is no longer their problem, right? It's still their problem. It's still their waste. Different parts of the world are now measuring their healthcare system and healthcare providers on their ability and capability of reducing CO2 emissions. And we would love to help them explore what that journey could look like for them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Andy. Do you have any last words?
No, Lucas, thank you for inviting me to join. This has been a lot of fun, and look forward to hopefully doing this again.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was Andy Marshall from Sterilis Solutions, and until the next time.